All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual Rebel Recharge lecture. I'm Gabrielle Engel, a proud 2010 Boyd School of Law alumna and your UNLV Alumni Association president. It is always my honor to personally welcome each of you here, but today is extra special because we're in the middle of Women's History Month, a time to commemorate and encourage the study, observance, and celebration of the vital role of women in American history. Before we begin, I would also like to give a special welcome and thanks to Blake Douglas, Associate Vice President for Alumni Engagement and Executive Director of the UNLV Alumni Association, and Renee Rivera-Gelfi, Associate Director for Programs and Events, for producing today's virtual lecture. Our next virtual Rebel Recharge will take place on Friday, April 14th, and is entitled How I Saved the Earth: Actions, Impact, and Change. Participants will walk away with personal sustainability actions to implement into their lives and be able to say, this is how I saved the earth. We have a wonderful lineup of engaging and educational talks we are excited to share this spring. You can see our full schedule of events at engage.unlv.edu/events. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and one of the many women we celebrate this month for the exceptional work that she is doing. Dr. Nancy Lowe is a nationally recognized expert on sports marketing, corporate sponsorship, leadership development, and creating gender parity within sports organizations. She specializes in research with a focus on the economic value of women's sports and marketing sports to women. She is the author of the Business of Women's Sports Handbook 2019 and the Handbook of Sports Marketing Research, along with numerous other scholarly publications. Dr. Lowe was the first woman to serve as president of the Sports Marketing Association from 2013 to 2015, and is the first to serve a second term as president of SMA from 2020 to 2022. In 2021, Dr. Lowe was recognized as the namesake of the Lowe Award by the Sport Marketing Association, given to recognize outstanding work in diversity, equity, and inclusion in sports. She also served as the editor for Sports Marketing Quarterly from 2010 to 2012, and she continues to serve on the editorial board. Currently, Dr. Lowe is building the Sports Research and Innovation Initiative at UNLV, and in fall 2021, she became the founding director of the Intercollegiate and Professional Sports Management Master's Degree Program at UNLV. She holds rank as a full professor in the College of Education. As an expert in sports business, she has been quoted in media outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, Street and Smith's Sports Business Journal, Houston Chronicle, and in international publications from Argentina to Canada. Dr. Lowe serves on the chair as the chair of the Intercollegiate Athletics Council at UNLV and as an advisory board member for the PGA Golf Management Program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Lowe.
Thank you, Gabby. I appreciate that. And it's so great to see so many of you all here today. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen. All right. So today, my intention in talking with you all is I'm going to share with you a research study that I've been working on with some colleagues from both Canada and the United States. So what we have here is what we call DisruptHERs, building a new model for women's sport. Before I get started, I'll share with you a little bit more about myself, just so you have a little bit of an understanding of why I do what I do. First, to start off with, I am the product of college sport. I was one of the first college scholarship athletes at a Division II school in Colorado, where I ran cross country and track, and I had the good fortune of running for an Olympic level coach. So we had teammates that ran in the Olympic Games. We also, just this last year, our university won their 59th national title in cross country and track. So very proud to have had that college sport experience. And I levied that to become a high school and college coach. So again, track and field and cross country was my sport. From there, I went into college athletic administration for a short period of time, Truth of the matter, I had an experience as a coach in which I experienced sexual harassment of my student athletes. And the reality of the situation at that period of time, unfortunately, still remains to some degree today. My student athletes were told by our athletic director that nothing was going to happen to improve their situation, that all that would happen is they would be embarrassed if they continued to tell the story of what was happening to them. Unfortunately, this was the coach that was my direct supervisor that was in charge of that team. And hearing this directly from our athletic director, I lost faith in college athletics, to be honest. And so I left college sport and went into pursuing my doctorate. And as it says here, I became a gender equity advocate at that point in time. I learned a lot about Title IX and what should have been protecting the female athletes that I was working with. But truth of the matter, again, I did not know anything about Title IX as an athlete or as a coach. And so it's been my mission to educate people about gender equity, about Title IX, and I've done quite a bit of writing and research in this area. But more interestingly, what I found when I started studying in this area, what I thought was an incredible opportunity, which was that there was no investment really happening in women's sport. Now, this was back in like the 1990s. So the very first investment became Nike investing in our U.S. women's national soccer team. But I'm talking 1995. That was the first time that they actually took them on a tour to help develop their skills to compete on the world stage. And so what I saw was an incredible opportunity. I thought, wow, if sponsors could just, see what Nike sees, they could invest in women's sport and we could take women's sport to a whole nother level. Well, fast forward to 2023 and it's actually happening, but it's taken a long, long haul to get to this place. So that's the research that I've been focusing on. That's some of the research I'm going to share with you today. I was, as was mentioned, the Sport Marketing Association president, but more importantly, here at UNLV, I started a master's degree program over COVID. It's kind of the big project I had. So we literally launched the Intercollegiate and Professional Sport Management master's degree program in the fall of 2021. So we've had one graduate that finished in December, and we'll have our first actual class graduate this coming spring. So please get the word out about UNLV having a master's degree now in sport management, because Las Vegas is on fire when it comes to sport. And it's an incredible time for people to be getting this degree. And in that space, also as part of the UNLV Sport Innovation, we're doing everything we can to engage the sport industry with UNLV and to get our students involved with the sport industry directly as well. Just such an incredible opportunity. So I'm going to go through a few things, this research first, and then I'll open it up for questions afterwards. So what this study on the disruption in women's sport is really all about is we've noticed that there was a need to examine how change has occurred in women's sport, in particular, how it has changed with regards to how women's sport is marketed, sponsored, endorsed, promoted, covered, invested in, capitalized upon, and even broadcast. So what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. Here's how what we call the old model. This is how sport is typically produced and consumed. So it starts with the athlete and the sport. So you have an interest in an athlete, you have an interest in basketball, for example. Traditional media is where you go, whether that's newspapers or television, radio to some degree. That's where you learn more about the sport, maybe follow the competitions, learn about the athletes, and so on. From the media, we move down to what the media actually does. Media creates interest. So if you didn't know about a sport happening, you would not have a lot of interest in it. This is where actually this model doesn't work for women's sport. So one of the things that happens with the traditional media is we know that they only 4% of traditional media coverage is actually allocated to women's sport. So if you think about that, that means if you tune into ESPN, if you read the RJ, because they're doing this as well, only about 4% of the content will actually include anything about women's sport, which basically means it's going to be really hard for you to generate a lot of interest if you're not seeing it, you don't know about it. Case in point, I'm guessing there's a great deal more media today about the Aces simply because Tom Brady has decided he wants to invest in the Aces. If that hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't be hearing about the Aces today, right? We might be hearing about probably the regional basketball tournament that's going on. So moving forward from there, media creates the interest, which creates the value. Bottom line is broadcast contracts are what pay for everything in sport, because ESPN, CBS, NBC, whoever it is, goes out there and sells the content that they have, the games, the competitions, to advertisers and sponsors. And they're the ones that put the dollars in and really make this whole machine run. So again, media creates the interest. Interest is then what has the value. That then drives the brand of both the athletes and the sponsor. It's a symbiotic kind of relationship. It also builds the brand of the media outlets. And then the cycle continues. So the athlete and the sport get more recognition, get more money, and on we go. But I've already shared with you that this model doesn't work for women's sport. And that's why we have looked at, what are we going to have to do to change the future? We've had the good 30, 40 years now of women's sport trying to use this model, but with the breakdown right here in traditional media at 4%, we're never going to be able to be as successful. So what does that mean? That means that we have to change the culture. We have to change the story. Historically, a lot of the stories about women's sport were quite honestly not very positive, right? The cultural norms have been very difficult to challenge and to overcome. But as you see here, we're now getting to a place with Megan Rapinoe and others that women athletes are taking ownership of women's sport and creating a whole new story. So what that leads to is what we call digital disruptions. And digital disruptions is in fact a theoretical understanding of what is happening right now. We are seeing very systematic changes that are disruptive in the sense that we're seeing an erosion of boundaries. What this really means is your cell phone has changed the way that we consume sport, right? And by changing the way that we consume it, what I mean is before, to produce something, it had to be produced by the media. Now consumers can produce it. So you yourself can go on and share a video of a competition or share an image of an athlete or say what you think, right? You can be a producer, in fact. So what this means also is that we are capturing value with regard to how consumers really want to see the athletes and the sport. And this is something that, is really disrupting that age-old model, because what the sport industry has always said to people like me is, well, we only produce, or cover sport that people are interested in. And of course, it's a chicken and egg kind of argument, because if they cover it because people are interested in it, then the things they're not covering, there is no generation of interest, right? So we've kind of gone back and forth on that for years and years and years, trying to say, you have a much bigger role in the media with actually creating value. And that has been something that has failed women's sports. So on an industry level right now, we have major upheaval. The way that has worked out, there's three particular characteristics that are attributed to this kind of theoretical approach on digital disruptions. The first one is the process starts with digital innovation, and then it quickly erodes competitive positions. So some of these major media outlets, we've heard about newspapers going by the wayside, going bankrupt. And a lot of that is because, like I said, we as consumers now can create content on social media, and that kind of content is what people are looking for. So it's eroding the competitive position of the media players that we always had to go to for content. And so now women's sport in large measure is just bypassing traditional media. Those of us who are fans of women's sport for quite some time now, we've been able to find women's sport. We've had to find it by learning from one another where to go and how to find it. It wasn't easy to access, right? So we had to bypass traditional media. The second piece of this is a characteristic of digital disruption impacting the system of value creating actors. So breaking and recombining the kinds of linkages among resources that have always facilitated how things were done in the past. So what this means is athletes have direct access, right? So female athlete agency is what we call it, where athletes can communicate directly with their fans through social media. And this has created this whole new level of connection, and fans can communicate directly to the athletes as well through social media. So that female athlete agency piece means that they can create their own brand. And in creating their own brand, telling people who they are, what they stand for, they're actually able to get more sponsorship and get more investment in them as an athlete. So that's a major disruption as well. And then the third big disruption has been this idea of multiple firms affecting the value creation and capture. So in this case, today's a great example. Increased sponsorship and investment in women's sport is finally happening. Just today, I read that Buick, during the March Madness tournament, has committed to spending 50% of their ad budget on the women's tournament and 50% on the men's tournament. This is a huge shift. Historically, traditionally, maybe 20% of their ad budget would be spent on the women's sports side. So that increase in sponsorship means there's going to be a whole nother level of value created around women's sport. So 3 different ways that digital disruption has taken place. Now, just to give you an example of what the effects of digital disruption are, you may or may not be a soccer fan. I don't know. I'm new to soccer, but the NWSL is one of the biggest success stories in all of women's sport. So here you see the NWSL had a 493% viewership growth in 2020. This isn't even 2023. This was back in 2020, which exceeded the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball, all by a landslide, right? So the growth that's happening in women's sport is even bigger than the growth that's happening in our traditional sports. So we see this idea of bypassing traditional media in the fact that the way that NSL was able to get so much viewership was actually on a platform called Twitch. If you've never heard of Twitch, it's probably because you're not a gamer. Twitch is actually a platform where esport competitions live. And so it's a well-known platform for that group of folks, but they actually were the initial platform in which people could access NWSL games and watch women's professional soccer. That's translated now to CBS signing a big contract to cover the championship of the NWSL last year, and now doing it again coming up with this next year, because what you see there, 915,000 viewers tuned in for the championship, which was the most in history. So nearing 1 million viewers is pretty substantial. When we look at female athlete agency in this particular league, Megan Rapinoe is a name most people know. It's become a household name because she's a very dominant national women's soccer team player and also an advocate for pay equity. Both Megan and Sydney Leroux have Sydney has over 6 million followers on social media, and Megan has nearly 6 million. So that tells you they have tremendous influence, and that whole dynamic I was talking about, like reaching out to your fans reaching out to you, they're probably at the top with regard to making that happen. And then the next one, the increased sponsorship and investment in women's sport. I already mentioned Buick pledging 50-50 for basketball, but Ally, the financial company, was the first to make this pledge and has challenged other brands to do it as well, saying that they will, from this point forward, pledge to invest 50% of their budget on women's sport and 50% on men's sport. So it's not like they're not going to invest in sponsoring men's sport, but they're going to equal the amount that they're pledging, which is incredibly a huge shift, because one of the biggest things we haven't had in women's sport is the same level of investment. Similar example in the NWSL is the Angel City team, which has multiple celebrities and athletes who've invested in the ownership of that team. So we're seeing like really different models of how investment looks now in women's sport. And to give you an example of what that turns out to look like as far as our evidence of digital disruption, the NWSL had the highest engagement rates across all leagues. So this includes MLS, NBA, NHL, WNBA, NFL, and Major League Baseball. And you see on Twitter for likes and retweets that the NWSL eclipsed everybody, more than doubling several, like the NHL and NFL and NBA. And even on Instagram, the NWSL is still far ahead of most other leagues. So that's, great examples of what today we are considering the true metric of engagement. So what we're doing now, my team and I in this space, as far as research goes, is proposing this new model, and that proposing how this new model is grounded in data-driven digital disruptions. One of the things that's been really difficult as someone who's been a gender equity advocate and really trying to educate people about women's sport for decades is that we haven't had the data to drive the argument. We haven't had the data to show that there is a real interest, there is a real need, and a real want. So we have that data now. We're getting more of it all the time. What this has led to is what we've identified as 5 major shifts: the sociocultural shift, a generational shift, digital streaming, which I've talked about a little bit already, women athletes as disruptors, and then sponsorship. So to give you a sense of what the sociocultural disruptions look like, historical challenges to women's bodies, I could probably teach an entire class on this. Things that you would not even imagine could possibly have been believed, but there was a medical doctor some time ago who made the assertion that women would literally have their uterus fall out if they participated in too vigorous of physical activity. So for so many years, decades, women were discouraged in all sorts of ways from participating in sport. And why that matters is because, the media again, and the kind of social belief was that women just simply were not interested in sport, or girls weren't interested in sport. And in fact, historically, it wasn't that. It was that we were told it was bad for us. It was bad for our health. And also that, obviously it counteracted what were considered gender norms. So it wasn't seen as feminine, right? So fast forward to Title IX, 1972, and trust me, there was women's sport going on before 1972. But 1972 was when Title IX was passed, and that's when, at least in educational institutions, the discrimination on the basis of sex was no longer legal. And I say no longer legal because it really was happening prior to 1972. In fact, I have data in my mind that shows it's continuing to happen, but in particular, it wasn't until 1992 that Title IX started to take real effect as far as creating gender equity. So what did we see? We saw this spike in participation once participation opportunities were available to women. And one of the places where you see a real big shift is now with our own Coach of the Year, Becky Hammond. Becky played college basketball. Becky coached, in college, but then in particular was able to land a position with the NBA. That is such a game changer because right now, the number of women coaching women's basketball is, well, actually the number of women head coaches in all women's college sport is hovering around 40%. So it's crazy to me that we've had women athletes participating in sport at a very high rate for several decades now. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Title IX last year. And yet we have more men coaching women's sport than we do women, right? So this is why it makes such a big, it's so very important to see someone like Becky, who here our own local, WNBA head coach is doing something that is really opening the minds and eyes of people in the entire sport world. The interesting conversation when she took this job was, is this a step down? And that's a great point in how people view sport still, right? She was an assistant coach at an NBA team. And so she took the head coach and people are like, oh gosh, but it's just the WNBA. So maybe that's a step down. Of course, she doesn't see it that way. She's gone on the record saying, this is exactly what she wants to do. And this is where she wants to be. Will she one day be an NBA coach? Time will tell. But unfortunately, that's still seen as better than the WNBA. Now, on a monetary level, without question, she'll make more money as an NBA coach than a WNBA coach. But I would suggest that part of the reason for that is the NBA just celebrated their 75th anniversary, whereas the WNBA just celebrated their 25th anniversary, right? So the NBA has a 50-year head start, if you will, on getting to the level of investment and just overall fandom than as compared to the WNBA. So some other major sociocultural disruptions. We're all aware, I think, of the systemic abuses that have gone on in women's sports. So gymnastics and the Larry Nassar situation, very high profile, but also the NWSL had to fight systemic abuse, and that has been as recent as just last year with some major upheaval in their professional league. And now a lot of that is happening in the broader soccer world. So Canada has been fighting it, and with FIFA happening this year, we're hearing more and more about that. Other sociocultural disruptions, the WTA standing up for human rights when there was a Chinese player that went missing and she was being censored, and the commissioner of the WTA said, we are not going to play again until we know she's okay. So that, the really interesting thing is, like, on a sociocultural level, women have been fighting these sorts of battles in ways that men just never have had to, right? Men have never had to fight, for example, for pay equality. I have the photo here from the last FIFA competition in which the US women won. And the most interesting thing to me about the victory was after they won the championship, the fans were literally cheering equal pay, equal pay. And that's powerful, because that tells you that it's not just, the athletes trying to get a message out there. The fans are on board telling the governing bodies that they want women to be treated equally to men. And that is one of the biggest sociocultural disruptions in my mind of anything. Moving on to generational disruptions. So I don't know how many of you are a member of the Gen Z generation. If you were born between 1997 and 2012, this would include you. They're currently 40% of our global consumers, which is a very big number. They also, along with millennials, hold $350 billion in spending power, which means in the business world, they are who the vast majority of marketers are trying to appeal to. They're really the ones that are setting the taste, if you will, and what's cool and what matters. The other thing that's really key about this group, they are the largest and most diverse and most educated generation. They have an urgency around gender equity and equality. They're not going to wait like my generation did. They're not going to be nice and apologetic and just be like, thank you, thank you, thank you for every crumb you throw our way. Instead, they demand it. They're very values driven with regard to their consumption, and very loyal to the brands that share their values. Why that matters, and why I have a picture here of our newest Aces player, which is Candace Parker with her daughter, is a great story that Kansas told about her daughter coming to her very recently with a list of brands, companies. And she said, Mom, these are companies that we can no longer shop with. Candace said, okay, that's interesting. What's the deal? Why can't we shop with them? And she said, very simply, these companies are body shaming. They don't embrace women and all the different body shapes and forms that women come in, right? And so again, in that place of like equity and equality and being loyal to the brands that share your values, this is her 12-year-old daughter telling her, this is what matters to me. Okay. So I think this is tremendous evidence of how different this generation is and what a disruption they're making on the larger scale. So when we think about, what does that mean with regards to athletes and teams? It means they also engage with them through things like gamification, and they have an affinity, of course, for social media because they grew up with it, right? It's just part of what they do. Also, as digital consumers, part of this digital disruption is how social media has altered consumer behavior. So I talked about this already a little bit, but the two-way dynamic dialogue is actually quite new still, where consumers feel like they can reach out and talk directly to their fans, directly to the leagues, that if they make a complaint, that it will be heard. Or if they want to, promote something and be like, hey, pay attention, it will be heard. And this is all focused on authenticity and engagement. So this is an important piece. Authenticity is something that is also critical to these particular consumers, meaning you can't fake it. They'll see through it. So great example was Black Lives Matter. When that movement happened, there were a lot of these consumers who were looking at how certain companies tried to say, oh yeah, BLM, we're all about it. And then they would put them on blast, right, and call them out, because they would say, your values, the things you're doing, are not aligning, right? So don't just be performative and saying it matters to you when in truth it doesn't. So this is a major digital disruption, right? That companies now, if they want to really appeal and have people that believe in what they do, they have to be authentic and engaged. They can't basically lie to us anymore on the same level. So digital branding offers this kind of new identity where fans have options, right? And they can promote the things that are true and authentic, and they can also like be more engaged with those particular companies. So the other piece that's super cool, you see here a picture of Asia Wilson on the phone, is we now have what we call NFTs. So this is like a digital way of showing your fandom. It's basically like art that you can collect in a digital format. So yet another major digital disruption and another opportunity for athletes to make money and leagues to promote what they're doing. Looking at women athletes as disruptors, if you don't recognize this woman, I would say she is the reason that the UFC has women's fighting. And I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but the reality is the UFC is the most gender equitable sport, period. Not because they wanted to be. Dana White went on record as saying, we'll never have women fight in the UFC. And then Ronda Rousey came around. And Ronda Rousey turned that opinion upside down. She became their biggest draw. So women as disruptors, I think she is one of the biggest examples of what has really happened and is happening when the powers that be in sport recognize that women are creating this great value for them, and there is a viable audience there. So part of that, as far as what the athletes themselves can do, that's the athlete agency piece. For the first time, women actually have control over their own image and how they're portrayed. Historically, there was this adage that a girl or a woman had to be sexy in order to sell, right? Sex sells. And we have good literature. My colleagues have done literature that shows that sex sells sex. Sex doesn't sell women's sport. But we had to do that literature to prove it to the ad agencies. And still, you'll see a lot of them turn female athletes into something that's not based on their athleticism or their perhaps the authentic image that they want to put forward. But now with athlete agency, the athlete herself gets to decide if she wants to be portrayed in a sexual way, a sexual manner. That's up to her. She can do that. And Liz Cambage was one who embraced that wholly. So, not saying that women don't still do it or don't want to do it. Some do, but at least it's their choice. And they can create a very viable personal brand. But again, it falls on them to be authentic in regards to like what their values are, what they stand for. And that's going to dictate the type of brands that want to partner with them. Social media is simply less restrictive, but that also means it creates more opportunities to basically blow it, right? To do things that are problematic, can be a slippery slope. But it offers a place to create relationship and visibility, and that's amazing. A lot of people feel like they actually know these athletes because they follow them so closely. They feel like they have a relationship with them. And that's important. Like as far as visibility, you might be a player on, say, the 11-person squad of the national women's soccer team that in traditional media would have never had any kind of visibility or presence. But if you have a compelling social media account and you're a compelling athlete, that's all different now. So this is part of this really important aspect of women athletes creating their own brands. Locally, again, Ronda Rousey turned the UFC into what it is today, but a more locally disruptor is Asia Wilson. So this season alone, her accolades were incredible, from All-Star Game captain, Western Conference player of the month, defensive player of the year, most valuable player in the tournament, and WNBA Finals champion. The other pieces of what Asia is doing is she has her own foundation, and in particular, that's focused on she has dyslexia, and so trying to help kids with dyslexia to overcome that learning disability. Her social media ranking is one of the top, which means she is now one of the most marketable WNBA players out there. In fact, if you watch this weekend, you'll see her in AT&T commercials and Gatorade commercials and different commercials. She's very, very marketable. She has her own podcast that she hosts with another player in the WNBA. She's a Kids' Choice Award winner. So again, Gen Z and below, even younger, are big followers of A'ja Wilson. But she's done a phenomenal job of being authentic with who she is and putting that out for others to engage and feel like they know her. In fact, she's such an important figure at the University of South Carolina that they have this statue that they is the only statue on campus for a woman athlete. So pretty impressive that she is one of ours here as the Aces. Other aspects of women athletes as disruptors, just in the big scheme of things, women are becoming some of the most marketable athletes, period. This includes NFL, this includes Euro soccer, this includes everything. Women were 5 of the top 10, with Alex Morgan, Megan Rapinoe of the U.S. Women's National Team, some of the most highly rated. Of the 50 most marketable, top 3 were actually Simone Biles, the gymnast, Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, and then Ashlyn Harris, who is actually one of the soccer players as well. What this really is looking at from sort of an economic or business standpoint is like frequency, reach, and engagement. These are the kinds of things that tell us that these women are really highly valued by their fans. Digital streaming is another really huge area where we've seen such a big change as far as how people are able to access women's sport. So cord cutting has been a major disruption with regard to consumption. I don't know how many of you have cut the cord, but we have so many new platforms for sport to be on. In fact, now, you know, the discussion is about Facebook, Apple, Amazon, how all of them are going to be covering sport from this point forward. What you see here is more evidence of the incredible growth of women's sport. So 852,000 viewers in the game of Seattle against the Aces. I know I went to one of those games with when Sue Bird played here for the last time, and we were lined up all through the MGM waiting to get in. It was phenomenal. But on the Disney networks, what you're seeing there are just like growth numbers that are unparalleled, right? The WNBA is growing like crazy. And a large part of that is because it's finally on these networks that people can access. So like I said before, you know, real sport fans, women's sport fans, for the longest time, we just had to work at finding it and trying to get access to it. Now that it's becoming accessible, we have this incredible growth. Sponsorship, same thing, incredible growth numbers. This is one area where I have to admit, for the longest time, this is where I've done so much of my research. And I really was arguing for sponsorship investment more because it's the right thing to do, right? Because of the moral imperative of gender equity. Well, the reality is, now that we have the data, now that we have the numbers, we get to argue that it is an economic imperative. This is where the growth is. This is where you get your biggest return on investment. And as a result of that, we're seeing these phenomenal changes. The upside of that argument, not only are you getting economic value in women's sport, but you're also getting the gender equity piece, right? That is a feel-good piece now, more than a moral or moral imperative. Other evidence of driving the sport disruption as far as sponsorship, you see here Epson and their investment in the LPGA. They're the #1 electronic sponsor, and Allies Pledge, I already mentioned, you know, as far as 50-50 for women's sport and 50-50 for men's sport. But we're also seeing, I don't know if you can see it kind of more in the background there, but these sponsors are being actually very active in their messaging and telling people, you need to pay attention to women's sport. You need to tune in because it's exciting, because it's interesting, because these women are phenomenal role models and incredible athletes. And that's something that is a major change compared to how women used to be presented. So getting into our local Las Vegas women's sport leaders, in the middle there, Nikki Fargas. If you don't know Nikki, she's phenomenal. She's the president of the Aces. She was a college coach for many years, played at Tennessee with Pat Summitt. She's currently this weekend in Connecticut covering a lot of the March Madness games. So if you tune in, you'll see her sitting there and talking basketball. But Nikki's done a phenomenal job of getting the Aces engaged in the Las Vegas community. They hosted the Title IX event last year that was just an incredible celebration of Title IX, recognized some of our other local women leaders. And of course, on the right, the breaking news about Sandra Douglas becoming the president of the Raiders. She's the first Black female team president in the history of the NFL. She is one of 5 Black presidents in the NFL. So that's a very new shift. There was only one up until 2 years ago. And then when 4 people were hired, along with Nikki, we saw a pretty decent shift in the representation of Black presidents in the NFL. But again, she remains the only Black female. There have been other women. Even at the Raiders, there was a female president years and years ago. But nonetheless, to be the head of an NFL team is an impressive sort of role to have, and definitely a very significant challenge in a major male-dominated sport. And then on the left, we have Jen Azzi and her wife, Blair Hardiak. The 2 of them are Chief Revenue Officer and Chief Marketing Officer for the Aces. The impressive thing about Jen Azzi is she was an Olympian back in the 90s, a gold medal winning Olympian on our U.S. women's basketball team. And she continues to be a role model both on and off the court here in Las Vegas, especially in the space of like women's sport business. Same thing with Blair, driving the marketing side of the Aces. So kind of to sum up, we have 3 themes: driving digital disruption, the changing values, the athlete agency, and authenticity. I always like to leave people with sort of a, what can you do? How can you help? There is no question that fans of women's sport have been the accelerators, and that future growth is dependent on these accelerators and on the fans of women's sport to get the investment, to have the management we need, to continue to develop the leaders that are going to create the innovation and change we need. Way you can help is help us to highlight disruptions in women's sport by tagging it on social media. So even if you're not this generation, this is where it's all at right now. We use Here's Proof as a way to show that there is, in fact, incredible following and interest in women's sport. And we use data to help tell the story and ask people to share data by liking, retweeting women athletes, coaches, leaders as influencers, and even telling the media when they fail and hashtagging disruptors. So the RJ has heard from me a lot this year when they were failing to cover our UNLV Lady Rebels. And especially as they went from having 10 wins in a row to 20 wins in a row to 22 wins in a row, I think it was, before it was all said and done. And you know, that's what we have to do. That's what other sport fans have done for years, is they complained if they don't see the coverage that they like. So I'm willing to do that, and I encourage others to do it as well, because they continue to say no one's interested, and I don't agree with that. I think we have evidence to show that people are interested. These are also great resources if you want to learn more about women's sport and follow like what's going on. All of these are either websites or podcasts, but that's another evidence of the growth in women's sport. I follow the Gist a lot, but the Goals folks are really doing an incredible job of keeping track of the business of women's sport. So with that, I will open it up for questions. You certainly can download our entire report if you're interested in learning more, just using this, this QR code.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions for Nancy, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you might have, or put them in the chat. And I'll just say a comment. Our Lady Rebels were so amazing this year, and I completely agree with you. We definitely have to have the coverage, because to go 22 wins straight, that is amazing work. And so I really try to get as many people to those games as possible. So something we should celebrate for sure.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. And the really cool thing is they sold out their venue more than once. So we're starting to get the followership. And for people, if you are an Aces fan, or even if you're not, there's kind of some overlap, which is really fun. So those of us that have been Aces fans, when a player gets to the line and is shooting 2 free throws, the announcer will say 2 shots. And then the entire crowd says 2 shots. And it was fun this year because that translated over to the Lady Rebels. And I don't know if Rebels fans knew where it was coming from, but if you're an Aces fan, you knew where it was coming from. But it was our own little tradition that was really cool.
Yes, we've been to Aces games as well, and the energy is high. I would argue that those games are probably more entertaining and fun and full of excitement than some of the other games I've been to in the past. And so if you haven't been to an Aces game, you should definitely go. Yeah, so again, I'm going to give another opportunity if you do have any questions or comments for Dr. Lowe. And if not, Blake, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you, or Nancy, if you do have any closing remarks.
I did have one question. Hi, Dr. Lowe. It's Haley. I was just wondering, I know most of this presentation was focused on professional, but when you think about like the DisruptHERs movement, do you think that there's more opportunity at a collegiate level, or do you think it remains within the professional level?
Good question, Haley. I think it's both. So, you know, there's no question Sedona Prince's tweet changed women's sport. We have to hold the NCAA to that change, and we have to keep reminding them that after her tweet, there was a full investigation and report produced in which the media rights alone for the women's basketball tournament came in at, I think, between $90 and $100 million that they were not that the NCAA basically wasn't getting, because they lumped the women's basketball in with every other non-revenue sport. You know, so these are the kinds of things that we have to, like advocates like me, have to keep reminding the NCAA and others that like this matters, and we want to see those sorts of changes made. Last year was the first year that the women's tournament, the Final Four, was branded as March Madness. So, you know, it's not a small thing. That is a huge thing, that now the women's basketball tournament is also considered March Madness. So these kinds of changes are huge for women's sport. I heard just this morning, Sports Business Journal, which keeps tabs on all aspects of sport, was reporting on Wisconsin's volleyball numbers for this year, and how now athletic directors are recognizing that volleyball is a place where they can get some really phenomenal growth. So, you know, I mean, if you tuned into volleyball this year, I saw a lot of sold out arenas, including Wisconsin, but Nebraska's been doing it forever. So, you know, we're changing. That's what I mean when I say changing the narrative and changing the story, right? Is that I can remember a day when you didn't even have to buy a ticket to go to a women's sporting event because they didn't think there was any value there. We buy tickets now, right? And the more interest that people get, the more potential for revenue there is, which means we'll have a better chance of keeping our outstanding women coaches like Lindy, because we'll be able to pay them, right? I mean, it's an economic imperative that we start recognizing the value that women's sport offers, college or pro.
Thank you so much.
So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is from Lisa. What future research are you looking at to extend these important findings?
Oh, Lisa, that's such a big question. Right now, we're working on trying to quantify the sponsorship growth, which is really hard to do because sponsors don't like to release the actual numbers of what they spend on things. Another little tidbit for you all to understand on kind of the marketing side is that the sponsorship number that you see when they say, you know, it's $1 million investment, that's only a piece of what goes into it. So typically there's a 1-to-2, if not 1-to-4 ratio of how much money the sponsor pays they pay the 1 million, but then they pay anywhere from 2 to 4 times more to activate or to let people know about this sponsorship and do all the kind of peripheral things. So they haven't done that on women's sports side. And when they've done it on the men's sports side, what I mean by that, if you went down to the tournament this weekend, you could go shoot hoops, you could go learn about all, you know, Coca-Cola and Capital One and all the different March Madness sponsors will have different activations. And they didn't do that for the longest time. But last year, women's Final Four, they were all over the place, right? I saw Coca-Cola activations and there was an entire fan fest. And so these are all the kinds of things that are changing the game. And we're trying to, just like this report, to quantify these things, write about what the value really is, and continue to show the broader, both scholarly world, you know, and the industry that the value is there, and we got to keep growing it.
All right. Next question is from Stephanie. How do you see the WNBA players getting equity in pay with salary caps, and not allowing charter flights for players?
Right. So hot button issue, right? I think that is going to have to change, period. We've already had one owner that got fined because he did pay for his players to fly. And, you know, we've seen our own organization fined over certain things that they were doing to incentivize players. They're both billionaire owners, so they're kind of like, slap on the wrist, whatever. I think that's a negative and a positive at the same time. We've got to have that level of investment that we are not requiring these athletes to fly and coach. It's ridiculous. Our college athletes are treated better than that. So, you know, I really look for that to change. It's the other piece is, like, quite honestly, the athletes have got to get more educated on collective bargaining. You know, their last collective bargaining agreement, they got some of the things they wanted, especially for moms, working moms. But they're going to have to get a little bit tougher and ask for more. You know, the WNBA is doing the best they can to get the amount of investment that'll allow them to do the things that they want to do. And so that's why I keep talking about, you know, how we grow the argument for the economic value that this organization and others like it present, because that's the bottom line. We've got to have more money coming into the league to be able to pay the players, to be able to raise the salary cap, to be able to fly the way and travel the way that they should be accommodated.
I have a quick question. If I can jump in, Renee, is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Dr. Lowe, this is Lanny Leroy. And with the name, image, and likeness stuff that's happening now on our college campuses, do you see much of a difference between the male athletes with name, image, and likeness and the female athletes with name, image, and likeness?
Yeah, Lanny, one of the things that people have been really super surprised by is that female athletes are getting some substantial deals. Two of the highest NILs have gone to women gymnasts. But also, you know, women's basketball players, you're going to see this weekend, you're going to see 4 women's basketball players in ads, all with Buick that I mentioned earlier. So from Caitlin Clark to Kiki, I can't remember her last name, UCLA. There's 4 of them that'll be featured. And, you know, it's been really interesting to watch how it's unfolded. But along the lines of what I was talking about today with digital disruptions, the female athletes tend to have bigger followings on social media. So that engagement piece is creating more opportunity for them to leverage their brand and to earn NIL money. The Cavender twins that went from Fresno State to Miami, they're the first ones to, you know, end up getting their school in trouble, fined for breaking NIL policy. But they also are some of the athletes that are earning pretty substantial income because of their social media, right? It's not just their play on the court. That is what gets them some attention. But the kind of presence that they have on social media, all the followers that they have, is something that brands want to align with. So it's interesting. There's no question that, you know, people quickly think, you know, quarterbacks, football players, basketball players on the men's side. But there's a lot happening on the women's side as well.
If I could ask one more, then I'm one of those generational folks that still watch a lot of the sports stuff on TV. If I don't go to it on in person, then I watch it on TV. I don't watch it on the computer. I don't watch it on my phone. I don't do any of those other things. But I have noticed, I think, a rather large increase in the women's professional and college coverage. I mean, I bet I could watch every single one of our Lady Rebels on TV this past year. I mean, I went to several of the games, but if I didn't go to it, I'm almost positive I could have watched it. And the same thing with our Aces last season, that I think if I didn't go to the game, I could have watched every single game that they played. Have you seen an increase in the coverage? I mean, you showed some stuff about the social media and the digital stuff, but what about old-fashioned TV and cable stuff?
Yeah, so yes, the ESPN platforms have committed this year for the first time to carry every single one of the women's basketball tournament games. So from the start to finish, every game is being covered. And, you know, they now have ESPN Plus. So it goes from ESPN to 2 to U and on. So they're all being covered. As far as the Mountain West Conference, they're pretty lousy. And And I've shared this with Harp, our athletic director, and others, that the Mountain West Conference presentations really, it's because it's like the individual school that's preparing what's going out there. But they really need to get a handle on that, because you're right. Like, some of us are tuning in when we can't go to the game and we want to watch it. So you can watch it. You just go to the Mountain West Conference website and you can get all of the games. The quality is what I'm questioning. And that's one of the things that women's sport has had to overcome, is like the quality of the broadcasts have been far inferior to the quality of the product that we tend to see on the men's side. But yeah, you're right. As far as like television coverage has expanded and is expanding. I think the place where we still see a lot of difficult like pushback with regard to coverage is in print media and even radio.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it looks like we have another question that just came in. You said data show. Oh, can you see it? You want me to read it, or you got it?
Ashley, you want to talk to me about that?
Yeah, I'm just, I see a lot of debate around specifically Olivia and how she posts herself online, but yet she also has some of the biggest NIL deals. And so I'm just curious kind of how that plays in when we never discuss the sexualization of the male athletes.
I love that, right? We never discuss that. Yeah, the thing that's really interesting, like I said, like the brand of feminism that we have now is women saying, you know, I could be a feminist and present myself in a sexualized way. And it's like, okay, yeah, absolutely. It's your choice, right? If this is who and how you want to present yourself. The part that's interesting, I think, is who is the audience that you're trying to appeal to, right? If you are trying to be a role model for young girls or young female athletes, or you're trying to appeal to other women that, you know, are like you, maybe that's going to work, maybe it's not. If you're trying to appeal to men, and in particular as the kind of men who aren't interested in your athletic ability, but are interested in more of a, you know, seeing you as a sexual object, then those are decisions that you get to make as an athlete, right? A male athlete could do the same thing. They just don't see the need, right? And that's one of those things that is the cultural piece, where women for the longest time and still in many cases really don't think they have much value to present or give out to the world unless it's as a sexual object of some sort.
Thank you.
You're right. It's very controversial.
Yeah.
All right. I believe we're at time. So again, I'm going to go ahead and provide my thanks to you for presenting today. Blake, I would like to open the floor, see if you have any closing remarks. But thank you so much, Nancy, for being here today. I think it was very informational and a discussion that we need to continue to have.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you, Dr. Lowe. I think this has been a real informative hour, and I appreciate your time on a Friday afternoon and as part of Women's History Month. And all of you for joining us today. I think the information that Dr. Lowe has shared with us today has armed us to be better advocates going forward, not only for women's sports, but for equality overall in general. So we appreciate your time and your insight and sharing your research with us, and wish you all a great weekend, and hope that you will consider joining us for our next Rebel Recharge as well. So thank you all.